Beneath the limestone of St. Catherine's Convent in Savannah lay a sealed chapel no one had entered since 1749. The stone kept its own counsel, but the town had always known the shape of the secret inside it. A handful of letters, 23 pages in a cramped French hand, written in the summer when the heat would not let a body sleep and the river smelled of rice and rot. The church had tried to burn them. Someone didn't. What the pages described would have broken the bones of doctrine if bones could break. Because Sister Marie Terslaer, 51 years old, the convent's iron spine and the keeper of chastity itself, began to swell with child, it was not rumor. 3 physicians touched the truth with their careful, worldly fingers and could not deny what they found. Yet nothing about it fit. The father was a 17-year-old enslaved boy named Thomas who wrote a fine hand, who lived like a shadow between library shelves and candle smoke, and whose name would be spoken in whispers that tasted of fear. And when the question came, the question that snapped like a trap and closed on every mouth in the room, Sister Marie did not weep or hide. She stood before the altar, as straight as a spear, and said she bore a miracle. Savannah in 1748 contradicted itself with every breath. It had been founded as an experiment that forbade both slavery and spirits, and now the riverbanks shone with rice and money. Barrels and bodies moved to the rhythm of profit. The denominations quarreled quietly for the souls of 3,000 people. St. Catherine's rose on 3 acres near the Eastern Road, the plaster bright as bone, its bells ringing the day into obedience. The convent taught the daughters of planters to read, stitched charity into statements of account, and owned 9 people who worked the kitchens and the gardens and the stairs no one noticed until they creaked. Sister Marie had come from Quebec with winter in her gaze. She had enforced French rule in houses holier and harder than this one, and Mother Superior Josephine had begged for her like a medicine. The cure ran hot. Sister Marie inventoried prayers until they behaved, rearranged silence into a schedule, raised a committee that sniffed out transgression better than bloodhounds. The novices learned to measure their footsteps by her shadow. She rarely spoke above a murmur and never needed to. Thomas copied letters in a hand that made merchants trust replies they had not yet received. He dusted spines and tied bundles and fetched volumes Sister Marie requested from the locked press, French journals on husbandry, English pamphlets on medical innovations, a Latin treatise on the humble terrors of female anatomy. No one saw him as a man in the way that mattered. Men were kept out. He wore invisibility like livery and moved with the apologetic grace of a flame in a draft. Heat built like a sentence that summer. Sisters lingered in the chapel after Compline, heads bowed to catch the night's thin cool. The first chip out of certainty came in October, blood on the hem of a nightdress that should have been beyond such cycles. Then the fainting in the chapel, the quiet panic of the infirmary, the measured hands of Sister Catherine who had delivered a score of town babies and knew what a womb whispered when it woke. The medical log trembled with crossings out until it settled on the simple words no one wanted to read. Symptoms consistent with early pregnancy. Mother Superior called a council in a beeswax room that smelled like ledger paper. Father Benedict, the chaplain, brought his red cheeks and his faith in facts that kept worlds from falling. The physicians would come. The Archbishop would write. Until then, they would keep the doors closed against the weather of gossip. Sister Marie folded her hands and told them what she believed. If the Lord chose her as he had once chosen another Mary, who was she to refuse? She had kept her vows. She had not been alone with a man. Let any examiner look through her conscience as through glass. The letters went north. Replies came back like thunder. Physicians set their cases down on the convent table. Dr. Drayton from Charleston with his careful eyes, Dr. Pritchard from Savannah, who had caught half the town, Dr. Whitefield from London by way of Georgia, a gentleman certain he had seen every trick a body could play. They examined, recorded, compared notes. 15 weeks, normal progress. No miracle that a man of science would write down, and yet nothing else any of them could say would unmake the fact of it. Then the interrogations. The bishop from Charleston with the starched righteousness of distance, and a Jesuit with a pen sharp enough to draw blood. They asked about hours, rooms, keys, why the midnight prayers, why the chapel that was meant to be locked, why the library at 11. Sister Marie's answers fit, each one a stone in an arch, a need for greater devotion, research into monastic practice. Inspection of storage for sacred texts. The arch held until the bishop spoke a single human name. Do you know a young man called Thomas? Sister Marie's pause was so slight you could have missed it if you had not been waiting to hear it. She said he copied letters. She said he was diligent. She did not ask why the bishop's voice had gentled for the question. She knew. Thomas waited in a classroom too clean for comfort, hands hooked together until the knuckles ached. He had sent a note because he could not keep the facts inside his skin. When he spoke, he did not beg. He told a story made of rules, instruments, solitude, and a promise large enough to drown him. He said Sister Marie had read of a method that kept bodies apart and still moved life from one vessel to another. She had asked for his help without touching him. He had refused. She had offered freedom, the word that convinces even careful men to lift their heads. He told them about the glass, the small syringe, the 8 attempts, the way the chapel smelled of stone and oil and prayer. He told them he never saw her in the act. He told them she never laid a hand on him. He told them the papers granting liberty were false, that he had found the truth in the Mother Superior's desk when the hinges of the world were already creaking. He told them he was finished being useful to someone else's holiness. The bishop had him guarded from the city as much as from the church. Mobs do not attend to nuance, and Savannah had plantation owners who believed a rope could restore order better than any tribunal. The priests argued among themselves until argument felt like piety. Was virginity a fact of flesh only, or could a woman betray the thing she vowed by going around it with tools and cleverness? Was faith served by an experiment that tried to make a marvel on a schedule? What weight did the life of an enslaved boy carry on scales that had been adjusted for centuries? The clergy convened in the chapel under the painted saints. Sister Marie came heavy with child and stood like a woman who knew sentences were for other people. The cardinal asked whether she understood why she stood there. She smiled without warmth and said she supposed they doubted God's capacity for workmen. They laid out the evidence. A syringe still smelling faintly of wine and boiled linen, the journals with the edges singed where someone had thought better of keeping them, the testimony written out in Thomas's precise letters that made the words rise like pins from a cushion. She answered with scripture and logic and a refusal to be ashamed. God made the laws of nature, she said. Why should obedience to them not be a form of worship? Miracles had always borrowed earthly things. Mud, spit, a staff that could be both wood and weapon. Why not glass? When they named Thomas, when they said deception, forgery, danger, her composure thinned and then held. She spoke of intention like a raft, and they spoke of consequences like the sea. Outside, angry men lifted musket stocks against the convent door until constables pushed them back, with flat blades and promises of order. The judgment came wrapped in mercy's language and tied with iron. She was stripped of her habit, exiled north, silenced. The baby would be taken at once and placed with a faithful family. Thomas would be sold to Boston for safety and profit dressed as Prudence. The church would say there was no miracle and speak softly of pride. She asked only what name the child would carry and whether anyone would ever tell her the truth. The answer was no. The birth arrived on a February night when the air in Charleston sat motionless and the candles guttered with their own exhaustion. Labor took her apart, then put her back together. She refused the laudanum and held the eyes of everyone who tried to look away. When the baby came, the cry was strong. Red skin, clenched fists, the weight of certainty in the midwife's arms. A girl. 12 minutes were granted by a doctor who knew melancholy could make fevers out of air. In those minutes, the mother memorized a life. Hair damp as river reeds. The flexing of a new mouth. The astonishment of warmth. They carried the child downstairs and out of the house, and the sound of the closing door went through the room like a blade lain across cloth. After, Sister Marie lay very still and let time pass over her like water over stone. She wrote pages that argued with the air because no one else would permit the conversation. Letters to God, to the child, to Thomas. She confessed what deserved confession and held fast to what did not. Pride was a sin, yes, so was despair. But what name did you give to the desire to reconcile the mind God made with the mysteries God kept? She would not repent of having tried to hold both in the same hands. The child was christened Charlotte in a Richmond church and grew into a woman who played the piano with a seriousness that hummed in the ribs of those who listened. She wrote good letters and sometimes paused, pen hovering as if she could hear a story behind the story of herself. She lived an entire life without the word Savannah ever crossing her threshold. Thomas left Boston under winter clouds that chased ships like wolves. Halifax took him in with cold more honest than scorn. He counted barrels for a Scotsman who paid in blankets and beef and did not ask about Georgia. In the year when the harbor froze like pewter and men's teeth cracked in their heads, Thomas wrote neatly in a ledger until the ink clotted, then lifted crates until his hands bled, and then disappeared into the blank spaces of the records that do not keep the names of the useful. Some say he took freedom in the way men sometimes do, stepping sideways out of a life and refusing to be found. Others say the cold finished what Savannah began. Halifax kept its own counsel. Sister Marie sailed north to Quebec under a false death and took vows that required her to vanish while still breathing. In the chapel of perpetual silence, she learned the language of gestures and the taste of snow at matins. No one recorded whether she found peace, but the quiet in that house was as strict as hers had ever been, and sometimes two severities cancel each other like sums. St. Catherine's emptied by inches. The sons and daughters of planters have long memories when scandal touches their powder. Coin purses close faster than shutters in a storm. The convent sold itself into warehouse, and the chapel that had watched the experiment was walled up and left to dream. The church swept papers into fires and called it prudence. A young priest palmed 3 letters and slid them into his own life where no one would think to look. The rest of it, rooms, voices, the smell of wax in winter, turned to the kind of story that grows knots with the telling. People in Savannah got old and died, and told their grandchildren a nun had sinned or been sainted, depending on who needed the moral more. The physicians who had touched a paradox and lived long enough to doubt themselves wrote down questions in journals no one else opened until the leather crumbled. A merchant in Halifax wrote that the clever clerk sent from Boston had departed my service and left it at that. A well-loved woman in Philadelphia slipped a torn leaf of Luke into a box of keepsakes. The underlined words about a conception without a man lay there like a seed in sleep. History did what institutions ask of it when they are large enough to demand. It looked away. But stone keeps books the way the sea remembers the shapes of ships. Behind the sealed wall, the chapel kept its night air and the faint thumbprint of a hand on a bench. Somewhere between the sentences the church preferred and the ones the world chose to forget, a woman old enough to be barren made a body remember an old song. Somewhere between obedience and audacity, a boy bartered hope and found out what the price of hope can be. Somewhere between those two edges, a child breathed and cried and lived as if the miracle were not the manner of her making, but everything that came after. If you strip the tale down to its beams, what's left is simple enough to hold, a body not expected to bear life bearing it, a promise made to the powerless and broken against the anvil of fear, an institution choosing silence over confession, paper surviving fire by the accident of one set of hands. The rest is angle and judgment. Call it heresy, call it hubris, call it faith with a scalpel in its pocket. Whatever name you choose tells as much about you as it does about them. The chapel still sleeps. The mortar still fills the doorway like a held breath. Outside, the city has learned a new rhythm, and tourists walk past with cups sweating into napkins while the river keeps its old slow time. But some nights, when heat lifts prayers toward the ceiling and makes even careful people reckless, it is possible to stand in the street and imagine you can hear a page turn behind the wall, the dry whisper of it, as if someone on the other side has begun reading again from the start.